All right. So welcome everyone. Happy to see so many people returning to what is a very abstract topic on a Wednesday night. So last week we went into the math of eigenvalues and what they have to do with dynamical systems. So I wanted to just again step back and look at this as qualitatively as I can and kind of lay out what we're doing and where we are. So I was thinking, if you were to explain dynamical systems to someone as a toolbox or a set of step-by-step operations for analyzing something, what might you do? This is not the only way, but it's a trajectory in the infinite space of possible trajectories. And so you identify some key forces or growth and decay patterns. Forces are often the right way to think about it if you have the second derivative, if there's some sort of acceleration. But in a lot of what we do in biology, we don't have the second derivative. So it's better to think of what's happening in terms of population growth, exponential growth, or bounded growth up to a maximum. And the reason I have that movie strip there is that we typically, when we're setting up a dynamical system, have more understanding of some sort of local phenomenon, like local forces or things happening in a snippet. And we don't really know how it necessarily started, and we are curious maybe about what will happen later. So we're kind of diving into the middle of a system, grabbing some insight into how things relate, and then we're trying to create something that helps us extrapolate both forward and backwards. So in fact, starting at what you think is the beginning might be a bad idea, because as we've seen, it might be some sort of fixed point, or it might be different from the typical behavior. We turn our dynamic intuition, which can be fairly hand wavy. We might be like, well, this quantity tends to increase with respect to this other thing. And those are captured in functions in this f and g. In this case, I've just got first order equations into observables or measurables, x and y. So that intuition that we get is converted into a set of differential equations. Then if we can't solve the equation, which is most of the time, we identify the fixed points, points of interest, if any. In this case here, I've drawn nullclines, but we'll get into what those are. But basically, it's where the derivatives vanish individually for each variable. So where they intersect is where the system stops. And then, if possible, we try to linearize, which is what Karthik was explaining last time, around the fixed points if they are well behaved. We can talk about what that means, but it's a little technical. And then we use the eigenvalues to infer behavior around the fixed points. And then for many systems, that will tell us qualitative behavior about the whole system once we've identified all the fixed points and done this procedure. So so Jesse said he liked this figure, so I just thought we could look at it again, because there's different graphs you'll come across in the book and in general with dynamical systems. And it's always good to keep in mind that in one dimension, you might plot the derivative versus the quantity x. And then you'll also have the solution, which is the trajectory, which is just one of infinitely many possible trajectories which depend on initial conditions. Then if you're lucky, in 1D you can always do this, but in other dimensions, if you're lucky, there may be a potential. And the potential allows you to fully cash out that landscape metaphor, because the system will tend to move downwards with respect to the potential, which is a convention you use. And in the case of something like fitness, the opposite convention is used, and organisms or individuals tend to move up the fitness landscape. Another thing you can show is a bifurcation diagram where you plot the fixed points, or in some cases, limit cycles and things like that, with respect to some parameter with which you're altering the system. So now you're looking at a whole family of dynamical systems which are parameterized with something. So those are volume knobs of some quantity, growth rate, or coupling constant or something like that. We won't be talking about bifurcation much today, but we'll come back to it at some point. Now, in 2D, we can't plot the derivatives in the same way as before. Earlier, we could plot the derivative as a separate, give it its own dedicated axis. So then anything on the x-axis is implicitly x dot equals 0. We just have to be careful here that we don't treat the axes in the same way when we're talking about 2 dimensions. Now we're just plotting the x. Where did I put b? Okay, no, it should be x and y. Maybe that. But now we're plotting 2 things at the same time. The dots represent where the system is at a particular point in time, and the arrows represent where the derivatives are pointing. So as we talked about last time, you can think of any vector as the sum of a vector along the ordinate and a vector along the abscissa, and you can completely specify it. So at every point, it's telling you where the system is pointing or tending to. The direction gives you where the direction the system is going, and the length will give you how fast it's moving in that particular direction. So on a phase plane, you can represent 2 pieces of data. It does get cluttered sometimes. So often people will scale down the sizes of the vectors or just draw a few, but it's always good to keep in mind. And here's where the sort of hydrodynamic metaphor becomes handy. You imagine the phase plane as a sort of liquid surface where and your point as something placed on the surface, and if the water is flowing in various directions, that's the direction the vector is. It also helps with the idea that you can't get any crossing. We'll come to that in a moment anyway, because at any point in the water it can only flow in one direction, not 2 directions. Now, okay, yes. So just to go over what we did last time from like a different angle, the 1D linear systems, pretty boring. They can be solved exactly, and I'm not going to explain why the solution is that, but I think most people can work that out fairly straightforwardly. And so now if we make a 2D version that's kind of like 2 copies of boring 1D systems, then you have kind of 2 ships passing in the night. They don't really interact with each other, and each dimension is oblivious of the other. So there's only a few things really that can happen, which we covered, but and they're captured in these diagrams. And the thing to kind of pull out and capture is, which I was initially, for whatever reason, not able to just immediately do it, is capture which is the fast direction and which is the slow direction. So if you just sort of think about it, just a few, I found it a little tricky initially, but just think about it for a few moments, and just the shape will tell you which is the fast direction and which is the slow direction. Is that, I'm just going to pause a moment. And would anyone like to volunteer for A, which is the slow direction?
I might be wrong, but I can give it a shot.
Sure.
I would say the slow direction is probably along the y-axis, because there's only one, or only along the y-axis will you actually approach it from that direction, whereas from the x-axis you'll approach it from many other directions. But it might be switched.
So does anyone else have an answer?
It's the opposite of what Annika said.
See.
But why?
Because a less than -1, it's if you just plug in the equation into the equation, every time you're going nearer to it at e to the 1 by e to the t, rather than less than 1 by e to the t than 1 by e to the t. So why?
So yeah, that is definitely the best way to do it. But if you can just, assuming, let's say, I mean, this is a big thing to keep in mind. assuming that the two axes are representing the same units in some sense, like they're axis equal in MATLAB. So what you can do is just look at this and say that the fact that it's very flat along the x-axis means that the system is rapidly kind of collapsed onto onto being parallel to the x-axis. So it's taking a while in this direction, whereas here it's kind of collapsed very quickly. So that is something that if you just think about it a little bit, the number of lines drawn is not exactly telling you anything. It's the shape that really tells you something. So the shape, because it's deviating from diagonal, so in this case, there is no fast or slow direction, that everything is moving in at the same speed. Whereas if it's bent in one direction, then it's sort of saying that, well, while this one has very rapidly kind of come close to zero, the other one is still on its way. And that, I think, is a helpful way to think about that the shape tells you that.
When people talk about like a fast manifold and a slow manifold, when you get to higher dimensional systems, is this the same sense of fast and slow? Do you know?
Yes, it is the same.
Okay.
Just the generalization of this. Yes.
Okay.
So we looked at this last time. You might be able to tell that this is a saddle point, the number E, because it's racing towards this point from the y directions and racing away in the other directions. So there's not a whole lot happening in 1D. There's one more thing that can happen, but not in those separable in that separable case. So here's a little bit of linear algebra, which we didn't really talk about. We kind of assumed that was known, but I thought it was worth sort of pausing on the linear algebra a little bit. So so those are the solutions. Now, when we write this in matrix form, which is handy when you're dealing with many dimensions, you have the derivatives can now be written as a vector, and the multiplications can be consolidated into a 2x2 matrix in the case of a 2D system. When the off-diagonal terms are 0, that means that there's no interaction. So you can call those off-diagonal terms the interaction terms, if you like, in analogy with, for instance, how statistical analysis will often interpret matrices. So now if we ask just in general, like, okay, so what if it's not just along the diagonal, what then? A thing that you learn in linear algebra, which 3 blue 1 brown is probably a good place to start with that. There is the symbol means there exists. So there exists a coordinate transformation where you can shift to a new set of dimensions and find a new matrix B, which is diagonal. So in this new coordinate space, you are once again in this diagonal realm. And interestingly, very crucially, B has the same eigenvalues as A. So you can study the system in this other space, and then convert back if you like. But we don't have to do that because of B having the same eigenvalues. So we can treat this as a sort of trick. Now, just to pause a little bit, multiplying a vector by a matrix is a linear transformation. And I always like to really pause and remind myself what a linear transform is. So this is a pretty good example here of a linear transformation of the Mona Lisa. And linear transformations are combinations of stretching, shearing, scaling, and rotation. So no weird spirally, twisty kind of processes are possible. They're basically, in a sense, uniform with respect to the entire thing that you're transforming, and that's what makes linear systems well behaved intuitively. There aren't really any surprises when you apply a linear transform. So what we have on the left, these 5 are examples of the boring exponential growth and decay that you could see in a 2D system along the diagonal. And you may, for instance, after rotating, find that a similar situation happens, but along two different vectors. And those vectors need not be perpendicular anymore because of the shear transform in the new coordinate system compared to the old one. But you still have a slow and a fast eigen direction. There are cases where the two eigen directions can collapse, and that's a degenerate case, which we briefly talked about last time. So basically, you can get like a scaled version of what you saw with the kind of separable case here. So what is eigenvalue and eigenvector? I wish someone had explained all this to me when I was first taught it. I was just like, some scary sounding German thing. And so,
hey, Johan, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So you said the eigenvectors need not be orthogonal. Usually, by definition, they don't have to be.
No. In this case, they aren't.
Okay.
Because it's a linear transform, it could be, you could take the Mona Lisa and shear it a lot, in which case you won't have orthogonal eigenvectors. Okay, that's a good place to pause. Where would you get orthogonal eigenvectors? There are two, if you want, two types of transformations, broadly speaking, where you would expect that. And just use gut instinct. Where might that be the case?
Expansion and contraction.
Yes, that's it. Expansion, contraction, and
rotation. Yeah.
That's good. That intuition is clear. So, what is an eigenvalue or vector or what? So it comes from the German word eigen, which I think is cognate to the word own, and it means characteristic or proper. So when you apply a non-degenerate linear transform, the degenerate case is sort of like this, but a bit weird and not that interesting. Something stays the same. And that something is characteristic of that particular transform. So it's the transform's own eigen signature. Now, again, just based on what you look at, is between the blue and the red vectors in this transformation from the left to the right, which is the eigenvector first. It's the blue, right? Yeah. And if you are good at assessing lengths, you can you can tell me what you think the eigenvalue is. In this case, it's 1 because there's no scaling. It's just everything stays the same there. But we'll see the scaling part of that. But if the eigenvalue is more than 1, the transformation is stretching along that eigen direction. And if it's less than 1, it's squishing.
And this only has one eigenvector, right?
Right.
It's not even diagonalizable.
Oh, there you go. It's a degenerate case, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
So is the reason the blue vector is the eigenvector because it's the one that stays the same between the two of them?
Right.
Okay.
Yes. Exactly.
It doesn't have to stay the same necessarily, but
Well, stay parallel.
yeah.
Only if the eigenvalue is 1 does it just sort of stay the same. Any vector. So you can think of the differential equation where you have a linear operator multiplying some itself, multiplying the vector as the same thing happening over and over again. Is you're just applying this linear operator over and over and over again. So the insight from linear algebra has to be can be imported. And in this case, we're sort of working backwards. We're saying that, well, this quantity, the eigenvalue, we know it's going to stay the same. So we for the time being ignore the derivative, and we'll say, let there be, you know, a principle of optimism, I think is what I call it somewhere. Let there be a vector v that that does what we just said, which is after we apply the matrix A, what we get, the result is just some scaling by lambda. And otherwise v stays the same. And with a little juggling involving the identity matrix, you can solve this. And in this very simple case where the off-diagonal terms are 0, your eigenvalues are just the two exponential growth rates or decay rates. That's what they are. So they're like, the eigenvalue in some sense tells you what the step size is as you move in continuous time. But the more complicated situation is the full matrix, where you can write the solution to the quadratic equation in terms of the trace and the determinant of the matrix. And this is what we worked out last time. Or we used this and looked at what happens with this. But what was not on the cards when we looked at the separable case was imaginary roots. And we know that quadratic equations can, in principle, have imaginary roots. So what happens there? Just as a side note, this is sort of a result of linear algebra that once you know the eigenvalues, you can plug them back into the equation that we wrote down to find out what the eigenvectors are. And then you can write the general solution to the differential equation as a linear combination of the two eigenvectors multiplied by that exponential scaling factor, which you should recognize from the simple case. So this is another sense in which linear systems are very simple to work with, because linear combinations of solutions are also solutions. So this is sort of the general case of what we saw as in the specific case as in the pure diagonal situation. But what if the eigenvalues are imaginary? We know that they come in pairs, complex conjugates. So one will have a plus I square root of 1 and one minus. So what does it mean when you have an exponentiation to an imaginary number? I'm not going to, I myself don't necessarily know exactly the best way to explain what the connection is, but I think those of you who are familiar with Euler's identity should get a feel for the connection between the imaginary number I and rotation by 90 degrees. So I'm just throw that out there as a little nod to why the complex number has something to do with any of this. And all of that is sort of baked into Euler's famous formula. So in this case, when you have a pure imaginary roots of your characteristic equation, eigenvalue equation, you get centers, which is the entire state space is filled with cycles. Wherever you place the system, it will go around from that initial condition. But in general, if you have complex roots, they'll have a real part. Here I've written that as A. And in those situations, you'll get a spiral. And when will it spiral in? If A is negative, and it'll grow if A is positive. Based on what we talked about before in terms of attractors, we can categorize all the possible linear systems. We have full kind of understanding of linear systems. And because the characteristic equation depends on the trace of the transformation and the determinant, that's tau and delta, we can basically know based on those two values whether the system will have unstable nodes, unstable spirals, centers, which you can see are just sort of like thin special cases, fine-tuned, as in the language that Ryan sort of says. It's only for that particular zone that you get centers. And for the other range, you get stability. Right. So the reason we are looking at linear systems, which are relatively boring and we don't really need all this infrastructure to talk about them because we can solve them exactly, is to help us when we get outside of the safe zone of linearity. So I always think of this Stanislav Ulam comment. I can't tell whether he disliked the term nonlinear science, but he said that using a term like nonlinear science is like referring to the bulk of zoology as the study of non-elephant animals, which, fair enough, if elephants were the most well-behaved, predictable animals on Earth, which they are not, as someone from India can assure you.
I suppose Ulam thought that the way a zoologist approaches a problem, it was like, okay, let's first consider that if it were an elephant, we can model this animal as an elephant.
Yeah.
The perfect.
But yeah, I remember someone saying
it might be accurate for a rat.
Right,
yeah,
right.
I was thinking like a lab rat.
Yeah, I remember someone saying, "Oh, the word nonlinear is just a trendy term," and I can understand why people say that sometimes. It's like, oh, it's just one of those terms. But in this case, I like to say that I think it's deserving of all the hype in terms, like from the perspective of someone who works in dynamical systems, because linear systems are exactly solvable, and in general, there is no hope of a clean solution analytically in the nonlinear case. So you have to do something else. You can't just integrate and then calculate the exact trajectory. Which reminded me of the Anna Karenina principle. All linear systems are alike, sort of, and every nonlinear system is nonlinear in its own way, which is an exaggeration, I think, because there are, at least among systems that we tend to encounter in nature, some similarities. But it's good to keep that in mind that, in fact, I read this somewhere that people who work with differential equations as part of their research can develop intuitions, a little bit like a zoologist or a veterinarian with respect to a particular animal. But that intuition does not necessarily take you very far for very different systems. So that is the spirit in which one can take this. So it also reminded me of the story of the three blind men in contact with the elephant. So in the case of the nonlinear system, if the blind men share some information, some qualitative information about the topology of the elephant, they will know quite a bit about it, quite a bit about its overall shape. So, and what that means is that...
Before we go into the nonlinear systems, the way they are analyzed, we've seen that linear systems can be linear systems where the determinant is not singular, then you can exactly solve it. Right. There is actually another, we'll probably not cover it at all. There is actually another theoretical idea, mostly associated with von Neumann and Bernard Kukmin, which is that you can always convert any. They talked about the existence of that system rather than the actual way to go about doing it, which is that you can always convert any system of differential equations into a linear system by a suitable change of variables, where the number of variables might go up to infinity if it is required. So they kind of defined what you would call as a linear composition operator. And you can go about converting your nonlinear equation into, it might be 3-dimensional nonlinear equation, but it could end up as a 25-dimensional linear equation by suitable change of variables. But that's another thing where people have actually tried to completely linearize their system and study it as such and avoid all the pitfalls of nonlinear systems and so on. So that idea is called Kukmin operator theory, or von Neumann-Kukmin operator theory. And
I remember watching a lecture about this. It was like some sort of magic. So what's the catch?
The catch is you can't really there is no method by which I can, if you give me a set of ODEs which are nonlinear, there is no method by which I know how to actually make them into n-dimensional linear ODEs. There is no way to come up with a method to do that. It's kind of like saying that if the Lyapunov function exists, then you know that it's the same way. But people have tried it, and that is also another way to think about nonlinear systems, which is that in some space they are actually linear. We don't know what that functional space is.
Okay.
But we can say that it exists. That's about it.
And
I imagine
is that related to, for instance, in machine learning, the idea that when you move up into a sufficiently high dimensional space, you can always find a separating hyperplane?
Kind of, but not slightly different, I would say here. It's not the
Something
same.
to look into. What was the name of that, the professor who gave that lecture?
It's Rob Law might know him. Steve Brunton Lutz.
We can send it in the email when we.
Lutz or Brunton, I don't know, one of the two, had a lecture on that.
Yeah, that was quite interesting. So basically, there are these awesome solutions which, if they happen to land on your head, well and good. But there's no way to. There's no algorithm for finding those types of solutions.
I mean, another catch would be that you lose interpretability. The more variables you end up with, you find it harder and harder to interpret what's happening dynamically.
I missed the first one. What did you say? Another catch?
Is interpretability.
Interpretability of those higher dimensions, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I suppose if all you want to do is predict what your system is going to be doing a certain number of time steps in the future exactly, then you don't need to interpret the
well, the interpretation will kind of become different if you're going to reframe it in this whole, like whatever I talked about in terms of Kukmin operators, because they kind of then become like a spectral analysis rather than like variables that you're interested in. So it's kind of like doing the same idea that we do with take a signal and instead of studying it in the time domain, to study it in the Fourier domain. So it'll convert to that kind of a problem. So the interpretation, I'm not sure whether it's getting really affected in that approach.
But yes, there are weird tricks out there. So yeah, I was just saying that once you lay out all the sort of special interest zones of a dynamical system using the methods of looking for the fixed points and special sets in the space, you can make fairly accurate qualitative claims about the rest of the space, because the rest of the space is in some sense just a matter of, as Strogat says, using common sense to link up the arrows that you've drawn based on analysis of the fixed points. So what Karthik derived last time was the Jacobian, which it can look a little scary. It's like, oh, look at all those derivatives lined up in a box, but it works just like the matrix A from the examples in the linear system. And it's not that difficult to work out how you get there by linearizing a multi-variable system using the Taylor series. So when the first derivatives don't vanish, then you can linearize confidently. And you're now looking, you're kind of zoomed in into a region around the fixed point. And so you're using this variable epsilon, which is small changes in your x and y. And you use your Jacobian exactly as you did in the linear case. So you can study, are things moving around, or are they moving inwards or outwards? Or, saddle point. So we've mentioned this a couple of times, but in a dynamical system, which is, you can't have trajectories cross each other. So at every point, your vector, the field of your derivatives has to be pointing only in one direction. So you can't have overlapping lines in your space. And that, it's seemingly in a small point is what helps you with this qualitative analysis. So in 2D continuous systems specifically, when you know the fixed points and the properties nearby, you can learn about the global behavior. So the example that one of the examples that he gives, I didn't kind of go too closely into the justification for the setup, but basically you have X's rabbits and Y sheep, and the 3 there signifies that the growth rate of the rabbits is faster than the growth rate of the sheep in a 3:2 ratio, but the rabbits are more sensitive to the presence of sheep overgrazing in the same resource. So the -2 here means that growth rate, the decay rate of the rabbits is more sensitive to the sheep than the sheep are to the rabbits. So this is a lot nonlinear system because it has multiplications of x and y, and I'm not going to go through the actual calculations. They're fairly straightforward. And so you can lay out where the fixed points are, and there's no other fixed points. And when you go through the process of linearizing and looking at the Jacobian at each point, the Jacobian has to be computed for the specific point that you're interested in. You'll get arrows pointing out, but you can't necessarily immediately know where they go everywhere because you have to take into account the other fixed points. So using just sort of smoothness arguments, there are no crossings and no right angles. You can complete the picture basically. You just have to link up the arrows that seem like they're most likely to be able to link up. And you'll get something like this, which Strogatz says it's just sort of eyeballed, it's not a computed solution. And he goes on to show that that's pretty much what you see in the, if you do it carefully and mathematically. So that's, in a nutshell, the whole set, one of the things that dynamical systems theory in its qualitative form gives you is this loose idea of the specifics, but you can analyze the fixed points and use these basically topological criteria to understand what's happening globally. But there, if there are pathological cases where some of this will require more careful analysis, such as when you have a fixed point where the linearization doesn't work, then you have to look at higher derivatives and things like that of the Taylor expansion. So I didn't got through this a little faster than I thought it would, but we have now time to discuss any of this in more detail, because I just sort of threw the limit cycle diagram in there and hope for the best for what we do subsequent, because we have I think we could spend some time on that, but I think we can now we now have infrastructure in place to look at how neuroscientists look at spiking using some of this phase plane analysis. So any questions, comments?
Yeah, for this rabbits and sheep example, And for nonlinear systems generally, you said that for linear systems, you can solve them so that you can get a trajectory for any given initial conditions. You can say at this time delay, this is where you'll be at these values. But with a nonlinear system, you can't necessarily do that, right? Mathematically. I hear people talking about simulations all the time with, I'm assuming, nonlinear systems. So is that how people create a solution? Is instead of solving, you make a simulation and then you just plug in for these initial conditions and then let the computer calculate the time? So we haven't talked about that at all, right?
So yes, this is what I do. A significant proportion of my time is spent doing this kind of thing. So you write down and he in the book he talks about it. He shows the Euler method and the Runge-Kutta method of approximation. So those methods, depending on your needs, you need to use more computationally expensive but slow methods or more loose methods. But they're all approximations. And in pathological cases or cases where things are very sensitive, you might, as you run your system, divert quite a bit from what the real system is doing. In cases where you can compare the exact solution to the simulated solution, you can see how errors accumulate. But in cases where there is no exact solution, all you can do is look at the most computationally expensive and carefully constructed numerical method. So there's a whole world of numerical methods to deal with dynamical system differential equations.
Does numerical mean simulation in this case?
Yeah. So when you run a simulation, in fact, just to jump to the famous Lorentz attractor, that was discovered via simulation. So he didn't, sit and do something like Henry Poincaré might have done. He just ran a simulation. It was a weather simulation. I don't know exactly what he was simulating, but we'll get there eventually. If you just press enter and see what the system does over time, and then maybe change initial conditions and so compare a bunch of different trajectories, you'll sometimes see chaotic behavior.
So something that I think would be helpful is to connect in something like this rabbits and sheep example, the formula that you have there, the two that define the system, and how that would create all the trajectories that you could simulate each trajectory. That connection in something like MATLAB code or along those lines.
Yeah, I can show you what it looks like for the Euler method, because that's all. I'm lazy, so that's all I use. So let me. Well, maybe
we can do this another time.
I don't want to write things down. I can show it to you next time, but basically you take this differential equation, which is a dx over dt, right, is equal to some f of x comma y with some parameters. So the Euler method is you say x at time t is x at time t minus 1 plus some delta t times f of x. That's it. That's called the forward Euler method. And you do that for each of your variables. You can do it all in one. And you're basically stepping the system through the vector field, basically. So the vector field pushes the system in the state space. That's one way you can think about it. And so it's basically just multiplication and addition. But the more accurate stuff has just got more terms, but that's all it really is. There are very fancy methods that are variable time step and use tricks to optimize. I don't use all that stuff much. So,
Johan, I can share my screen. I think I might have a Lotka-Volterra like thing simulation just based on two species.
Oh, cool. And
It says you have disabled participant screen sharing.
yeah, one sec. Yeah, okay. So you're going to show like a MATLAB Lotka-Volterra system?
Yeah. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is slightly different from that equation of rabbit and sheep that Johan showed, or from Strokat's book, but this is more the actual competition between rabbits and foxes, or rabbits and foxes.
Nice.
So basically, you're starting with some initial value, which you can assume whatever they are, initial conditions. And then there are these interaction parameters, which is what those 3 and 2 and all that stuff that he had written. But in this case, it's slightly different. We can even go through these alpha, beta, gamma, delta values, because, I mean, it's just a simple, it's not too different from what Johan showed for the rabbits and sheep. So on the left-hand side, you're basically seeing for some parameterized set of parameters and whatever initial condition. For these choices of initial conditions, you actually see that the two kind of follows in some sort of an oscillatory pattern. Okay, so and the foxes kind of lag behind the rabbits, and then at around time 50 steps in the cycle of their interaction, we kind of perturb the rabbits to actually plunge down in their population to see what happens. So you see that following their plunge down, the foxes kind of like also go down because they have to eat the rabbits to survive. One of the assumptions of this model is the rabbits have infinite grass to feed on, so they are not going to die off. If all the foxes die off, then the rabbits will just breed to infinity. So that's one of the assumptions of this model. But if you perturb it slightly, you see that this goes down and then this follows it. But then during the recovery, you see that the oscillations are becoming higher and higher in amplitude, and the rabbits are closely followed by the foxes in their population growth and whatever, and decrease. And you can correspondingly look at the face plane of the same. So you see that initially this is where the rabbit, this is the face plane of the original, this cycle over here. So they're kind of going around in circles. We saw from the linear example that if they're going in circles, then or this is not really a circle. This is kind of like an elaborate closed orbit, but you know that they are oscillating. That's what it means. That the two variables are oscillating in this system. But then after perturbation, it kind of moves into this larger orbit, basically, and it kind of keeps going. Actually, it should go the other way around. It goes this way.
I was like, these figures in code look familiar. I was like, oh, I wrote it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know why you didn't show it. I have it with me, but
Not where I saved it.
And I also have it for nth order version and all that stuff, but it's not visually possible to show them. There are interesting 3D models for this where you can actually start talking about chaos and all that stuff. But in this model, for 2D systems, you'll not see any chaos or any other strange behavior. But what you also observe in this kind of a system is if you perturb it, instead of moving out and then coming back to an original oscillation, that was this original whatever blue circle, it takes up its own other big cycle. So this is not a limit cycle. That's the other thing. This is not really a limit cycle here. Once you have perturbed the system, it has gone on to a new cycle of oscillations where you can see that the amplitudes have increased or decreased and so on. So this is the simulation side of it. You can actually show that for the parameters of alpha, beta, delta, and gamma, you can actually show for what relationships between these alpha, beta, gamma, and delta, you'll actually get oscillations versus not oscillations, versus one animal equilibrium versus two animals in an oscillatory equilibrium versus when they will both go extinct. All those possibilities can be done very similar to the linearization analysis that was presented today and last week. So, but this is a very useful model to simulate in what all the different techniques that you can make use of, whether it's Euler or run your ODE23 solver or whatever. But this is very useful.
Is this an example of a center because it's not spiraling outward or inward?
We shouldn't talk about centers here because
no, this is a center.
We shouldn't talk about centers because we have perturbed the system. It's not a center. Centers are not to be confused always with whether they are. We don't know whether it is an attractive or a dissipative.
Oh, that's an unstable fixed point.
Yeah. So
it's not a center. It has eigenvalues with negative real part or positive real part. Sorry.
Yeah. So
we should have imaginary part.
A center at all. A center is a perfect circle actually. So because it's only dependent on I omega, so it'll be a circle.
Right.
So what would you call this then? What category?
This is an oscillatory. This is an oscillatory closed orbit, but it's not a limit cycle as well, because if it's a limit cycle, once you perturb it, it has to come back to it. So this is just systems where it's of increasing oscillatory cycles. So
a center has to be an ellipse.
Yes, a center has to be an ellipse, not actually a circle. It has to be an ellipse. Sorry.
So this system has a really weird conserved quantity?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's kind of cool.
What was so? In fact, there is a Kolmogorov actually found out what the. I think there is a Kolmogorov reduction for this system too. I don't remember the exact details.
This is a nonlinear system, right?
Yeah. So I take it back. You should call it a center. It's just not circular. But it's weird because it's a conservative system.
It's a nonlinear center. A linear center will be an ellipse.
You just change, this is related to some linear center by a nonlinear change of coordinates, right? Because it has a conservation law, it's integrable.
Okay, can you show the equation? It looks like it's behind the figure, right?
Yeah. So the equation is basically just this.
So the H is what I call the delta. That's the small push.
So it's just alpha x minus beta xy. Instead of, so there is no x square term, negative x square term as he had in the rats and sheep example. So this is all you have to be looking at: alpha x minus beta xy and delta xy minus gamma y. That's the equation of the system.
That actually reminds me of another thing that I thought might be just handy to mention is what a nullcline is, because when I first learned this stuff, I don't think I necessarily was taught that. We sort of picked it up, in fact, in computational neuroscience course, but it's a pretty handy. It's just part of the way of doing this qualitative analysis, but it's good to keep it in mind. I briefly mentioned it, but basically, the nullclines are. So remember, we are plotting the we're not plotting the derivatives directly as coordinates. So in principle, you could have arrows for all the vectors, but x dot and y dot are both in the functions of x and y. So that means that the two derivatives are individually lines on this plane. The places where they are equal to 0 are lines on the plane. So where they intersect, if they intersect, is where the system is stationary, because both x dot and y dot are 0. So I mean, nothing is changing. And so you can just geometrically see that very few things are possible in a linear system, because the nullclines in a linear system have to be straight lines. So now just imagine, move around these straight lines however you feel like. There's nothing you can do to make two fixed points. And that relates in a way to the absence of stability. Although I don't know exactly how to make that argument completely linked with why, with how to recognize whether there are limit cycles, because that involves a more sophisticated thing, which he mentions, the Poincaré-Bendixson theorem. So there's a bit more math you have to do to make inferences when the nullclines are curved. But the basic idea is that that I was trying to get at here is that this is a sort of the base case of why the geometry and the dimensionality just give you sort of for free some qualitative insight into what's possible in the system. So for nonlinear systems, there will be some weird curve. They could intersect many times, and you'd have all kinds of fixed points. And here's where even though you can't always define an energy function, it can sometimes just to get your a mental picture, you can think in terms of this the landscape metaphor, right? Which is that, well, if you know that there's an attractor in one area and an attractor in the other, it's like, if you know there are two valleys, between them there has to be some ridge. Otherwise, they can't be two separate valleys. They would only be one. So there are mathematical equivalents to that kind of way of thinking. And then that's a sort of topological way of thinking, because we're not looking at the exact shape of anything or the exact orientation. We're just looking at these overall relationships of curvature that tell us a lot about the system. And we can infer things about parts of the system that we haven't seen. If I know that there's one type of fixed point here and another type of fixed point over here, there has to be some kind of inflection point in the middle.
I have a question. You're saying we're not looking at the exact landscape. Couldn't you map out a pretty precise landscape by running simulations from a bazillion trajectories?
Yes, yeah, you can sort of do that. Sometimes even in systems that we work with that involve, say, more than 2 or 3 neurons and some dimensions, what you can end up with is weird notches in parameter space, where meaning that if you're not, like, however exhaustive you are in your picking of initial conditions, there could be some weird island where there's something else happening. And maybe Ryan has some topological insight into those cases, because he studies some of this from the physics angle. But I've encountered this. I'm pretty sure Himanshu has encountered this, and Karthik might have too, where because have you ever heard the term graduate student descent? So a lot of what we did, as opposed to SGD, stochastic gradient descent. So a lot of what we ended up doing is creating the large, complicated dynamical systems, which we couldn't, or at the time didn't want to analyze using these methods. And so we would tweak parameters of various sorts and try to get the qualitative behavior that we expected. But then every once in a while, we might add some noise or move the parameter slightly and get a completely different behavior. And then with slightly more exhaustive searches, you might find that there are these qualitatively similar behaviors in disjoint parts of parameter space. It's quite fascinating. And I don't know how to explain or even study that. But that is, with neural networks, I keep finding that. Which is I get a qualitative behavior for one set of parameters, I break the qualitative behavior, and then I find it again somewhere else in a disjoint region of the parameter space. I'm pretty sure Himanshu has experienced this.
When you go into the examples next time, would you be able to show that?
No. I'm normally not saving my files for that. Those are the things that kind of cause nightmares. Because you want your system to be relatively robust. So I would have to like run everything again, but they generally happen for large dimensional neural networks where you have where inhibition is doing something interesting. In basically competitive networks, where your inhibition constants and the nonlinearity of excitation are up to you, can cause all kinds of wild behavior.
I can show an
Makes me
example of a
imagine.
wild behavior for three. I can show an example right away for three species competing. Can you see it? My screen. So I mean, it's just three species: X1, X2, X3. You can call them whatever. They are all in a competition with one another for some set of parameters. Here, it's just two parameters, alpha and beta. The right-hand side is the phase space, and the left one is the configuration space. You have really bizarre behaviors, which are one, like they all start at some random values and they go up and down. What you see is one follows the other, and then it goes up, and then it goes down. It goes all the way down almost to zero. You'll think that in the real world, these will be extinct. These species, when they go to near zero, they'll be extinct. But on the other hand, they kind of stay like really close to zero in terms of their population, and then they rebound back. And not only do they rebound back, they have like oscillations which are in increasing periods. See all these kinds of strange behaviors. So if you like go from in time, you see that the periods of them like having a certain population like go to almost their peak value, it keeps increasing, and they go to almost extinction, and then they come back.
And this is for a particular initial condition, right? This is one trajectory, right?
Matter. The initial condition doesn't matter in this. It's for a particular parameter set. The initial conditions being where the populations are at any given moment doesn't matter. It's the interaction parameters, alpha or beta, the actual parameters in the example, which is in the example that Johan gave, it's the 3 and the 2, 3x minus 2y. Those are the ones that matter. The initial values, initially you might have something that looks like noise. What's the long-term behavior is what you're interested in dynamical systems. And in these systems, for these sets of parameters, you see this weird behavior. But if I change the parameter, sorry, I just kind of coded this up, so bear with me if it doesn't immediately translate into. On the other hand, for another set of parameters, you see that it kind of oscillates and all that stuff, and then they all become stable at their own population level. They might have oscillated and started with any initial condition. And that's what you kind of see over here. It kind of starts here in this system, and then it ends up in some fixed point. So depending on the parameter choices you're going to make in fact, there should be another gamma here. You can actually change you can have anything from 3 species are in equilibrium to only 2 species in equilibrium to all 3 species going to extinction to chaotic behavior to that crazy oscillation that I showed you with ever increasing lengths of oscillation. And it's almost unrealistic, but you can see those behaviors. Like the thing goes almost to zero, but then and stays there almost close to zero, and then rebounds back all the way up. So you can see those really crazy behaviors too.
Any other comments, questions? I was thinking I do want to pursue some of the topological stuff that he talks about, but maybe we'll do that a little later. So my plan is next week I'll review a little bit about maybe the van der Pol oscillator and kind of get straight into the Hodgkin-Huxley model. So I think it'll be a little bit more neuroscience, because I would like to actually reread those original papers. There are quite a few of them, so I don't expect anyone else to read them, but I would like to read all 4 of them, and maybe the Fitzhugh paper. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about electrophys, or maybe Karthik. Well, I'll just talk about the squid axon and how they measured it and stuff like that, and ion channels, and then, time permitting, talk about the reduction of this 4-dimensional Hodgkin-Huxley system to 2 dimensions in the Fitzhugh-Nagumo model, which And there's an interesting little prediction that they made using the 2D version, which was then tested in a slice. It's a strange prediction, but meaning not of any major importance to medicine, for instance. But it was something that was inferred from phase-plane analysis, which was then confirmed, despite the fact that you were going from 2D to 4D. So it was a case of, it was a fortuitous mapping from 4D to 2D. Well motivated also. It's not it wasn't a fluke. So I'll end the recording now, and we can